And welcome, everybody. Welcome to Hawk Talk. And I'm your host, Bo. Whether you're East Coast, West Coast, or around the world, here we are talking our Seahawks. And, of course, some of the changes that are coming up. Obviously, there's coaching that is on the horizon for this team. We have some of the press conferences from John Schneider, some of the messages from Jody Allen. So there's a lot of change that's coming. Obviously, we don't know what personnel is necessarily going to look like or position coaches at this point, just because we don't know who's going to be at the helm. But we have gotten a list of potential coaches that they have reached out to that they want to have conversations with, some that are in the playoffs, some that aren't, some that make sense, and some that are a little bit of a head scratcher. And so we're going to go through some of these coaching options. We're going to go through some of the numbers that are associated with, what it is they bring to the table. And one of them, we're going to go over regular season numbers. Obviously, the guys that are in the playoffs, we don't have complete stats as far as the way that goes. But obviously, those teams, were good enough to get into the playoffs. So that says good things on whether or not they were a solid offensive coordinator, defensive coordinator. Granted, some of that also comes down to, the head coaching, clearly. And, of course, the personnel that's on the roster obviously weighs in heavy on whether or not the team is going to be good or not. But even if you have all the talent in the world, you need coordinators that can translate that onto the field. So some of these upcoming coordinators that they have on their list is they're good. They're good options to look at. And of course, we will also look at, the fact that they talked to Vrabel and they are slated to talk to Harbaugh. So those guys are also in the mix. But let's go ahead and chat a little bit about some of these offensive coordinators and defensive coordinators that are on the schedule to talk with the Hawks and, have a real chance at, potentially being the Seahawks' next head coach. So the first one, let's talk a little bit about Ben Johnson. He's the OC for the Lions. Obviously, the Lions are still in the playoffs, so they're not going to get to talk to him right away. But he is on their list. And some of the things that have been really impressive about Ben Johnson is what the offense has been able to do. Obviously, they do have talent. Jared Goff has turned into a formidable quarterback with the Lions. Not that he was bad with the Rams by any means. Obviously, he got to a Super Bowl with the Rams anyway. But so here's some of the stats that Ben Johnson would be bringing. And, of course, you also have to wonder whether they hire an OC or a DC as their new head coach. Are there going to be changes at those, is like in this case, he's an OC. So does Waldron end up moving on because they have an OC as a head coach? Maybe he wants to make those play calls himself. Tough to say. It will also give you kind of the stats of where the Seahawks lined up comparatively with these coaches. So, that way you kind of get a clear pick on whether or not it would be an upgrade from what we were doing, if it's a downgrade from what we were doing, if the pick just doesn't make sense at all. We do have one of those later in the show of a guy that's on the list that doesn't necessarily make a ton of sense, but all the same, he's going to get an interview anyway. So when we look at Ben Johnson here, that offense put up 451 points this year. That was fifth in the league. So that is a solid, solid top five offense. And they were a top five offense last year, right? So it's not like they peaked or anything like that. Like, this has been a quality offense the last couple of years. And so that's encouraging to see, right? And to give you some, comparison here, the Seahawks put up 364 points. So they were 17th. So a noticeable upgrade when it comes to scoring. Also means in the red zone, they were significantly better than the Seahawks were. So, that's an important stat because, at the end of the day, the Seahawks did struggle to punch it in the end zone. Well, they ended up settling for a lot of field goals throughout the season. So that's a stat that is really important because, even if you're not necessarily great in other ones, points wins games, right? So Huge difference in points there. Passing yards, Goff goes for 4,400, which was second in the league. And when it comes to the Seahawks, it was 4,100, which is 16th. And if you want the exact stat, it's 4,167. But, you get the idea. So they were 16th. So again, from second to 16th, I don't know that there's a huge difference between a Jared Goff and a Geno Smith. Now, granted, Geno was injured, so, that could have been the difference yardage wise, but those passing yards are including Drew Lock. So do I think that Geno might've got more yardage than Lock did? It's possible, but at the same time, these are a team stat, not a player stat. So I went the team stat because the coach is the team, not the player. And so that's kind of how we're looking at it there. Rushing yards, Ben Johnson's offense ran for 2,300, which was fifth in the league. And Seattle, they 1,580, which was 28th. So their run offense was abysmal. And, a lot of that is attributed to the fact that offensive line wasn't very good. But at the end of the day, you got to overcome those things if you're trying to win games. Not that that's an easy thing to overcome. We watched that with the Rams and the Cardinals last year, where both of them had dynamic offenses that couldn't do anything because they didn't have any stability in the trenches. And as much as you love the weapons that are around, if you don't have significant, if you don't have really good line play, it doesn't matter how much talent you have around it. So I do give the struggles in the run game a little bit to that offensive line, but at the same time, it's things you have to be able to overcome. So when it comes to touchdowns, they had 58 touchdowns as an offense, which was third. And then takeaways or turnovers, I should say. They had 23 turnovers, which was 14th. So it was an offense that was kind of middle of the road as far as protecting the ball. But when you look at turnovers for Seattle, it was 17, which was fifth. So they were actually better than the Lions as far as turning the ball over. So the way Seattle was currently constructed, they were a little bit safer with the ball. So ball security, that's good. The downside is their offense wasn't on the field quite as often, so that could play part of the role there. Third down percentage, they were completing third downs at 41.5%, which was 10th in the league. So they were good on third down. And, obviously that is an average for the entire season. But 41% on third down is, you can win a lot of games with that. So when you look at third down percentage for Seattle at 36%, and that was actually lower than that until the last couple of games, they were actually able to punch that up just a little bit, but that's still 23rd. And they were bottom 5 in the league for most of the year on third down. So it would be a significant jump if that transfers, from one team to the next on whether or not they can, convert on third down. But, that is a major stat there. And of course, their red zone percentage was 64%, and Seattle's was nowhere near that. Their 64% in the red zone was third in the league. So Ben Johnson, I think, could be a good answer for, this head coaching job if they were going to go with a coordinator. Again, it's an offensive coordinator, so you get somebody, like if you're going to move on, sometimes it's good to move on in as big of an opposite direction as you can. And, so if you go for an offensive mind, a younger guy, at the end of the day, Pete Carroll's not in there anymore. So you got to bring somebody in. So do you really want another DC? Do you want a recycled guy? Like, you got to kind of weigh those things out. Or do you want to try out a younger offensive coordinator that's had significant success over the last couple of years? Now, they haven't won a championship. Obviously, the playoffs are still going. They're still in it. So you never know. Could happen. But that's one that if they did go that route, I kind of like some of the things they were going to be able, they might be able to do with him. But then you still have a real question at what do you do at DC? Because as we're going to go over those numbers next, the DC, our defense was not awesome. So we'll put it that way. It's a nice way to say it, but the defense left something to be desired. So the next guy that's on the list, it's the Cowboys DC, Dan Quinn. Obviously, he did not have a great defensive strategy when they were playing Green Bay. They were getting beat all over the field. Guys couldn't tackle. You definitely don't need more of that in Seattle. They have really struggled to tackle, especially this year. You end up with guys like Tariq Woolen that got benched a couple of times because they weren't able to tackle. So, it's a real question mark if you want Dan Quinn. But with Pete Carroll still in the house, obviously Dan Quinn and Pete Carroll, they know each other well. They can play, they can scheme things together well. Not that we really know what Pete Carroll's role is going to be. It's just a front office to be determined kind of role, but you wouldn't have to worry about a chemistry issue within the building. I think that would be an open line of communication if, say, Dan Quinn wanted to bounce something off Pete Carroll just because he was his head coach once before. So I think when it comes to chemistry, Dan Quinn could work. Whether or not that ends up translating into wins, that's a huge question mark. So this is where we'll look at this. Points allowed, 315. So they were fifth in the league as far as keeping you from being able to put points on the board. That's huge because when you compare that to Seattle, they gave up 402, which is 25th in the league. And again, that it's why they ended up losing a lot of these games. It's not that the offense wasn't putting up some points, but the defense couldn't get off the field. And a lot of times the offense also couldn't stay on the field. They settled for field goals or they couldn't convert third downs. So, that would be a vast improvement. They gave up 3,400 passing yards, almost 3,500 passing yards, which is fifth in the league versus 4,200. Which was 22nd. And then this is the one that would be a huge upgrade from where they were this last year is their rushing yards they surrendered. So Dallas gave up 1,900, which was 16th, right? So it's not necessarily like they're amazing, right? But they're middle of the road. It's a serviceable run defense. When you look at the rushing yards given up for Seattle, they gave up 2,300, and that was 31st, right? So that is, almost the bottom, right? There's only one team worse than that, and that's a major concern. If you watched, games all season, teams could run all over them. So, kind of a major issue and something that they need to upgrade on. Obviously, there's a lot of nice pieces. They have some draft picks. There's elements that they can start to fill in. So I think that it is definitely something they can do. And if you bring in a Dan Quinn, our defense was solid when he was here. Now, obviously, that was the Legion of Boom time. And so the players were a little different than what's on the roster today. But there's a lot of talent on this roster still. So if you can get this defense turned around, get guys to tackle properly, that rush defense could go from 31st to, say middle of the road, not necessarily as good as 16th, but even if you are in the high teens, that would be a huge year over year improvement. And I would kind of take that as one of those moral victories, just to see that improvement as bad as the run defense has been. And then when you look at sack totals, the Cowboys have 40, which was 12th. And, the Seahawks ended up with 38, which was 10th. So that was relatively close. Third down percentage as far as getting off the field. This was probably the biggest swing. You got 38.5% for Dan Quinn's defense, which was 17th. So again, still not amazing as far as getting off the field, but significantly better than the third down percentage that was the Seahawks, which at the end was 31st at 46.3%. So that was something that we talked about on this show all year, is the inability to get off the field on third down. or on the offensive side, stay on the field on third down. So, those are kind of a thing. This is where they are very similar, and it's a bit of a concern because it's a discipline type of thing where penalties are. And when it comes to Dan Quinn's defense, they had 100. Well, as far as Cowboys in general, they had 115 penalties, which was 30th in the league. And there's only two teams worse than that. Seattle happened to be one of them. They ended up with 100 and I take that back. Seattle was marginally better. They had 111, which was 28th. So both kind of undisciplined when it comes to penalties. And so that would stay relatively the same. But there are some categories that they could benefit, in a big way from maybe bringing in Dan Quinn, and that is points allowed and realistically passing and rushing yards. So, if you could get this overall defense from that 31st position to or 30th, it's right around in there, depending on, which rankings you're looking at. If you could bring that up to a top 15, right? Not even top 10. Like say it's a top 15. That's a serviceable enough defense that maybe you don't lose games, the two games against the Rams, and maybe you don't drop that game against the Bengals. Maybe you squeak out that win in Dallas. So there's some games that had the defense just been middle of the road, able to get a stop here and there, just a tick better on third down, allowing third down conversions, stuff like that. Maybe those games change a bit, and we're talking about being, potentially in the playoffs, maybe divisional round, something like that. So, Dan Quinn could make sense here, but, at the same time, that is a little bit of a recycle. You're bringing a guy back. If you wanted Pete Carroll's, system to stay in place, you probably just leave Pete Carroll in place. So, tough to say exactly how that would work out, but it makes sense why they're high on the list. Familiarity with the building, with the ownership, so there's a lot of things that would make that transition easy as far as bringing him in. Okay, so then we can move on to the Ravens DC, Mike Macdonald. Now, that Ravens defense has looked great. It's been solid all year, and so this is one that definitely kind of makes some sense. It is a DC though, similar to Quinn. So having that defensive head coach, do you want to have that same kind of feel that we've had during Pete Carroll, or are you trying to rip the Band-Aid off and switch it all up and get that offensive mind? This wouldn't be that guy, but as good as this defense has been, you definitely have to take a look at him. And so this one, points allowed 280, that's best in the league, right? This Ravens defense has looked awesome, and the roster wouldn't suggest that they'd be able to do that immediately, but they do have some draft picks, and they have a lot of free agents, so they may not necessarily re-sign those guys. I think this roster could look very different as you move into the 24 season. But that being said, if you're going to go with a defensive guy, this one wouldn't be horrible. Again, 280 points, best in the league. Passing yards, 3,700, which is 8th. So, again, solid. Rushing yards is 1,800, which is 14th. So that's a slight bit better than Dan Quinn on that one. Sacks, which is 41, which is 16th. So, again, it would be a little bit of a little bit of a downgrade in the sack department. But, like I've said many times, the sack totals, I don't put a lot behind a sack number. I much rather see a high quarterback hurry rate than a ton of sacks, because you can overcome a sack. Say you lose 5 yards on a sack, you can overcome that if you don't have consistent pressure every time. Whereas if you have a high quarterback hurry percentage, maybe you're not getting home. Maybe you get home once or twice a game, but he's off his spot constantly. All of a sudden you see turnovers go up. You see more 3 and outs. So, or at least failed third down conversions. So as much as it's a great stat to look at, and it's a great individual stat for linemen, stuff like that. I really like a quarterback hurry rate. And so, I don't put a ton of stock in exactly what the sack total is. You still need them, obviously, but the hurry rate is one I kind of focus on a little more. Third down percentage was 36.4, which was eighth as far as stopping the third downs. So that is a 10% higher clip of getting off the field, which is significant. And then penalties, 102, they were 23rd. So also a fairly high penalty rate for that team. But, Mike Macdonald could definitely make some sense. Again, as bad as the defense was, there's a lot of upgraded numbers if you go that route. And I think they could be upgraded, just by bringing in a coach, because it's not like there's not talent. There definitely is. But, it's I didn't like schematically when they went from the 4-3 to the 3-4. I know they did that primarily because of Jamal Adams, that I do think probably isn't on the team this next year. But, the 3-4 kind of made sense with Jamal Adams because he's not a safety. They kind of use him as outside linebacker. Some of his best stuff is as a pass rusher. So he's almost kind of a, he's such a weird position because of his athletic ability. They kind of use him as the outside linebacker / D end type of thing for rushing. He's not great in coverage, so he is a little bit of a liability there. Obviously, staying healthy is a major issue, which is why I don't think he ends up still on the roster this next season. But I get why they kind of converted to that 3-4. But I would imagine with him off, maybe they go back to a 4-3, which has served this defense better over time. So, but Mike Macdonald could make sense, for filling this head coaching job. All right, so then we have another DC, which is for the Rams. Raheem Morris, points allowed 377, which is 19th. So, not as good as the other two, obviously. But this is probably falling closer in line to what it is we had. Now, that being said, there wasn't an immense amount of talent on this Rams team. They did the most with what they had, but they didn't have a lot of depth. So when guys got hurt, there wasn't really the answer behind it. They played inspired football. So, you can tell that organization can get guys to rally and play. So, I mean, you got to like that aspect of it. But when you look at passing yards, 41.95 versus the 42.59, so that's 20th versus 22nd. Those points allowed was 19th versus 25th. Rushing yards was significantly different. They gave up 1,800, which was 12th instead of the 31st that is the Seahawks. So that would be a huge improvement if you could stop the run. The problem with that is their run stopping ability also happened to have Aaron Donald in it. And so that's sort of that's a piece that doesn't come with a coach, right? That's not a coachable moment. Like Aaron Donald is a monster of a human. And so, you can't really duplicate what Aaron Donald can create in a defense. So I don't know that you could get that same kind of run stopping ability just by making that coaching change. So I don't really think that would necessarily get the jump that maybe some of these other coaches might. The sack total was 34. And of course that was 6th, but again, Aaron Donald exists. So that opens up opportunities because he catches a lot of double teams. So, I wouldn't put a ton of stock in this particular one. Third down percentage, they were 16th at 38.5. So that one would be better. Again, just about anything on third down on both sides of the ball would be a vast improvement from what we saw out of the Seahawks this last season. So not that I want to, talk bad about how it is we played, but third down percentage was a real issue all season on both sides of the ball. We talked about it tons of times on this show, other shows, why they were underachieving. That is a huge a huge contributor anyway. And then penalties. This is one that is kind of the biggest difference. This was a very disciplined team. They had 89, which was 8th in the league. So significantly better than the 28th that the Seahawks were. And, there's quite a few games that I think the Seahawks could have benefited from having a little bit cleaner football. Not having the penalties would have been huge, especially the personal fouls, unsportsmanlike conducts. Those are discipline style penalties, and they do tend to get a bunch of those, which is a problem. When you look at, if you get a holding call, there's holding on every play. I don't put a lot of stock in that. Sometimes you can get a pass interference that maybe, it's in the flow of the game. So, I mean, those kind of things happen. But when it's after the play and they're unsportsmanlike and stuff like that, which are absolute drive killers or a drive extenders, depending on if you're on D, right? But if you get or roughing the passer, those ones a lot of times are just kind of a bad decision. So if you can try to eliminate some of those, because some of the holding calls they're just going to happen. But if you can eliminate some of the bad penalties, or at least the easily avoidable penalties, then, that would be huge. This is something that Raheem Morris seems to be able to bring to the table. Now, some of it obviously is probably McVay as well, right? But, if you've got a team that is consistently figuring out how to stay disciplined, not get these penalties, that's huge. That's huge. So that would be a big benefit. There was definitely a couple of games that, the outcome could have swung very differently if there weren't, unsportsmanlike, some of the DK penalties that were drive killers, or, some of those after the play type of things, is a huge thing. All right. So if we were going to look back on the offensive side of the ball, there's the Dolphins OC, Frank Smith, and they put up a ton of points this year. So they put up 496, which is second in the league, right? Passing yards was just under 4,700, also second in the league. Rushing yards, 2,300, sixth in the league. Touchdowns, 61, tied for first in the league. Turnovers, they only gave it up 25 times, 21st in the league, right? And then third down percentage was just under 40.2%, which was 12th. So this was a dynamic offense, and some of that, sure, you can attribute to being speed, but Tua is not necessarily the most dynamic quarterback, right? He's very accurate, but doesn't necessarily, he does get tagged with that game manager kind of thing. He has, really fast receivers in Waddle and Hill. Obviously, Hill was in the conversation of maybe being able to be a non-quarterback MVP candidate. So they had some nice things around. But when you look at Seattle's roster, you also have a ton of speed. DK is very fast. Lockett is one of the more sure-handed guys in the league. JSN, also fast, proven that he is a good pass catcher. Bobo, again, also a good pass catcher. And so, you could definitely duplicate some of those passing yards. I think, again, you probably could have had a little bit better passing yards with the Hawks had people stayed healthy. Certainly the offensive line, give Geno a little bit more time. But when you look at those, that could be a significant upgrade on the offensive side of the ball. Again, if he's taking over that OC job as well, you never really know exactly how it is they're going to hire. Obviously, that's going to be left up to, John Schneider as far as exactly how it is they want to go about that. One thing I thought was really interesting is in the press conference on Wednesday, if you didn't see it, check it out. But John Schneider basically said that him and Jody Allen, which is, the main controlling factor here, is they wanted to keep the positive culture that has been built. And, that's also going to weigh heavy on the type of coach that you hire, right? Some of these guys may not necessarily embody that same kind of energy that Pete Carroll did. And I get the idea that that's the culture they want to keep. But when you bring in a new coach, there's some new culture that's going to come with it. And, whether or not that new guy is going to be able to keep that same kind of feel, tough to say. Now, it is a culture that John Schneider was a part of building, right? Pete Carroll and Schneider, they come in together. They've been working together for 14 years here. So I think it's something that they'd be able to kind of keep rolling, keep that always compete attitude. So some of those things, I think they'll be able to move forward. But as far as coaching style, I mean, you're not really going to know until the guy's in the building, and that can drastically affect what the culture is like. And, that's going to be a tough thing for Schneider to pull the trigger on, right? Because he's the guy that is essentially picking this next coaching staff, or at least the new head coach. I imagine your coach probably has some say over who they want as coordinators, but that'll be kind of a good thing to watch. But the press conferences with Schneider over this last week have definitely been kind of interesting. Again, if you haven't seen them, check them out. They are they're a good listen. Okay, so then we have the Giants offensive coordinator. This is the one that I said I had some very real questions about. And so Mike Kafka, they were bottom 5 in every category, basically. There's a couple of them that they were bottom 7. Right. So, for just basic reasons, we'll just say bottom 5 in general. Obviously there's some outliers, but overall. So this was a little bit of a surprise because this is a team that didn't do anything particularly well. And I didn't see anything out of the offense that made me think, wow, that should be the next head coach. Now, how much of that was, Dable? How much of that was guys getting hurt? How much of it was that offensive line was just terrible. But as a coach, if you're the offensive coordinator, you got to be trying to figure out how to get those elements to play better. So, those are, man, yeah. It's a coaching call that I'm a little surprised about. And again, I it's not like this is a team that was doing anything well. And so I have a hard time wanting to bring in a coach that is coming off of a horrendous season. There didn't seem to be anything positive coming out of it. There weren't even moral victories to look at during this season for the Giants, as far as I'm concerned. So this is a surprising call. It may just be one of those that they want to explore, and exhaust any opportunities that are out there. But then there's the other end of it. Mike Vrabel is still available. He did have a meeting, or is about to have a meeting with the Chargers. So, he's going to have some options. But, at the same time, you're looking at, they were bottom 5 in just about everything. Similar to the Giants, the only thing I kind of give Vrabel a pass on is I really think that this is not necessarily all Vrabel's fault. Because if you looked even at the last game of the season, right, they were doing everything they can to win. He was dealing with not having a ton of talent on the roster. You have a Derrick Henry that isn't quite the same guy anymore. You have a Tannehill that, he's well past his prime. He didn't even necessarily have a super high prime. You had, DeAndre Hopkins that they bring in, and, they paired him up with Will Levis. They never really seem to get on the same page. Levis gets hurt. Tannehill comes back in. They have a little bit better chemistry, but not great. The defense was okay. So even though they were kind of bottom 5 everywhere, so a little bit of a double standard, admittedly, I think this one falls a lot more on that GM than it did on Vrabel. I was actually a little surprised they fired Vrabel. 2 years removed from winning Coach of the Year, just because he had these elements. Last year, Derrick Henry gets hurt. This year, again, the offensive line wasn't amazing. Derrick Henry isn't quite the same back anymore. I could see Vrabel coming in and being an okay fit. It's just I don't necessarily hold those bottom five numbers the same as I do the bottom five for the Giants. And maybe that's a little bit of a disservice for Kafka, but I think Vrabel has shown enough that that's not necessarily who he is as a coach. That probably was more personnel driven. So we'll wait and see. He's definitely going to get a job. There's enough of them open. And of course, landing on Jim Harbaugh, we've seen plenty from him when he was with the Niners, right? He gets them to a Super Bowl. He is a proven winner at every level, coming off of this, national championship for Michigan. His resume speaks for itself. So wherever he's going to want to play, whether it's here in Seattle or, coach, whether it's here in Seattle or with Chargers, I would say Atlanta could have been an option, although Bill Belichick just went through his second interview there. Doesn't seem like you need a second interview with Bill Belichick unless you are, starting to talk about, hey, what would this look like if you do take this job? Because it sounded like more of the coaching staff or front office was present for that second meeting. That sounds more of a game planning session than necessarily hey, show us more of your rings, right? Like everybody knows what his resume is. So that makes me think that maybe Atlanta's probably out as far as Harbaugh potentially going there. So I would think when you're looking at the best jobs for Harbaugh would be, the Chargers, Seattle, maybe Washington, because you can kind of build whatever you want there. The jobs that you probably really don't want are like the Panthers. The Raiders are a real question mark because you don't have your quarterback, right? They're going to move on from Garoppolo. O'Connell is, he's probably not necessarily your franchise guy. So, if you're looking at a team that you want to rebuild, Washington probably makes more sense. If you want one that you can add a couple of pieces and win right away, that seems more like the Chargers or the Seahawks, especially because the West seems to have fallen off, or the AFC West has seemed to have fallen off a bit. So that is a winnable, that's a winnable division for sure, especially with how bad the Kansas City offense has kind of looked throughout the season. Excuse me. And then when you look at, the NFC West, outside of, the Niners, this was a pretty decent path to get to the playoffs. Obviously, the Rams put together a nice season. The Cardinals will be better next year for sure. They got some nice draft locations, and, they still have a pretty solid nucleus. So I could see multiple teams from the West, NFC West, getting into the playoffs next year. Again, I thought maybe the easiest route would have been to take over that Atlanta job. They have some decent draft picks, get a franchise quarterback in there. I thought that might've been a landing spot for Harbaugh, but they're not out of the Harbaugh mix. It sounds like they're going to have him come in next week. And so that should be interesting to see how that goes. But as far as we've seen reported so far, Belichick is the only one that's had a second interview in most of these places. And so I could see him landing there in Atlanta. That's an attractive coaching position. It's a weak division. If you're a Belichick hater, then you're going to be like, oh yeah, of course he's going to go there. Easy division, has some pieces already. You could be right back in the playoffs. But that being said, that would be an enticing location for any coach because of those exact reasons. You have some nice pieces. You got good draft picks. You do have some draft capital there. So, I think that's probably one of the better jobs. And Seattle is definitely one of the better jobs as well. It's a very young team. A lots of, first and second year guys going into their third year, obviously going into next year. But, there's that element that Pete Carroll's still in the room. And do you want to risk that being an issue? Tough to say. But this coaching carousel is going to be fun to watch. We're still not really any closer when it comes to the Seahawks, unfortunately. There's just been, it sounds like there's been a couple of phone calls, but there's been no in-person interviews yet, at least as we've been told thus far. So, but those were some of the numbers, and when you start looking at the numbers, I really like Ben Johnson as an option. If you're going to go with an offensive mind, despite the fact that they had the epic meltdown in the playoffs against Green Bay, Dan Quinn obviously is a potential fit, and we'll see how that works. But then when you start looking at the rest of these, Mike McDonald for the Ravens, possibly, Frank Smith with the Dolphins, potentially. But again, some of those numbers, how much are those hated, but aided, I should say, by just how dynamic, guys like Tyreek Hill are. So I'm glad I don't have to be the GM and make this particular call, because this is going to be a really tough position to fill, especially when you're trying to fill an absolute Hall of Famer in Pete Carroll, wins a national title in NCAA. He wins a Super Bowl here in Seattle. Any pick you make is going to be absolutely scrutinized, second guessed, because if they come in and they're awesome, perfect. If they come in and they're terrible, everybody's going to look at, well, why did you force Pete Carroll out a year too early, right? Or did they force him out to try and land Harbaugh, right? Because they knew that potentially he's not going back to Michigan. There's a lot of questions we don't know the answers to yet. Obviously, we're just speculating, and of course, going through the list that they put out of potential people that they're calling. But I mean, there's going to be a lot of pressure on whoever takes this job over. It's going to be very different than whoever goes in for the Chargers, right? You don't have to be amazing. You just have to be better, right? Here in Seattle, we've been a little bit spoiled over the last 14 years with Pete Carroll here, and really for quite a while, because even when Mike Holmgren was here, there was a winning culture. It's not like we're the early 90s Seahawks that were getting beat up by everybody. This is a team that is perennially in the conversation for, being in the playoffs, whether it's a division, whether it's a wild card. You don't typically talk about the playoffs without Seattle in striking distance. So if somebody comes in and they're not that dude, the first thing that's going to be double guessed is, why did they force Pete Carroll out? And then it'll also be, do they extend John Schneider? So that'll be the biggest questions. We're going to have more answers, obviously, as the weeks go on. These conversations, these interviews will start taking place, and obviously we'll start to get a better idea of where the team is headed. Then we can start looking at, are they going to have, who are they bringing in coaching staff wise? Then we can start focusing from there on, what free agents are they going to try and bring back? Who are they trying to get in the draft? All of those types of things. So as we move forward, there's going to be more of those questions being answered. But until really one of these guys gets selected, I think we have more questions than answers. And even in the questions we ask, we end up with more questions from them. So again, don't envy John Schneider's position here, having to fill Pete Carroll's position, because the wrong call probably get you fired. And I would imagine that this is sort of a short leash, especially with the, potentially looming sale of Seattle here in the next few years. It has to play a big role as well. So Other than that, thanks for tuning in for Hawk Talk. If you're watching on Roku, be sure to tune in the next hour. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure to like, subscribe, helps us bring more content to you. And other than that, enjoy this divisional round. There's going to be some awesome matchups. I wish the Seahawks were in them, but that just hasn't happened to be our year. But going to be some really good battles. Other than that, catch y'all next week.